Hi everyone, how are you? How was the food? How was the conference up until now? Any good talks? Well, I'll try to make this one worth your time. We'll be talking about the butler and the whale, the story of their friendship. But before that, I want to talk about something that's very important to me and I hope will become very important to you too. Namely, the Jenkins Tel Aviv area meetup group. Jenkins area meetup group is a jam, okay? I happen to be one of the organizers of the meetup group, and yeah, this is our great logo. This is the Israeli Jenkins. And I really hope that you will join too. You can scan the QR code and sign up for the meetup group. But the important thing is not to just sign up. We already have quite a number of members. And we already had a number of meetups, some very successful ones. But still, we hear a number of complaints about most of the content at these meetups being marketing oriented, because most of the talk suggestions we get come from vendors who want to tell about how their tool integrates with Jenkins and as a result try to sell that tool. Now, the complaints are justified. The problem is that for the last year, we've been trying to get more talks coming from the community, coming from you, telling about how you use Jenkins at your place, how you solved this or that problem, how you use Jenkins in some exciting, creative ways. And it's been going really slow. So the important thing after you sign up for the meetup group is think about suggesting a talk. Now, I do realize that most of us don't have experience giving talks, giving presentations. So I now offer mentorship, support, and advice to anybody who has any idea for a talk. Please feel free. Drop me an email. Here's my Twitter handle. Drop me a note, and I'll be happy to work with you to help you develop your idea into a talk or a presentation or maybe a blog post. Okay? And let's make it happen, because sharing knowledge is how open source projects grow, develop, and become as great as Jenkins has become after all these years. Okay, with that off our table, let's start talking about containers and continuous delivery. Yeah, by the way, before that, this talk will be an overview of all the different ways that Docker and Jenkins can play together. No technical deep dives, so if you want something more detailed, I've put the whole content of this talk in an ebook, which goes into much more detail. So go to this link and fill out a form, and the ebook will be on its way to your mail inbox. And now let's start talking. So before we talk specifically about Jenkins, let's say a few words about how containers are changing the way we deliver software. By the way, raise your hand if you're already using Docker. A lot of us do, okay. And that's great. Now, containers change every step along our continuous delivery stream, right? They change the way we build, package, and deploy our software. We as build, release, delivery professionals were among the first ones to embrace containers, because for us it was almost a dream come true, right? This vision of clean, sterile, predefined, easily accessible build and test environments is something that we always dreamt about, something that we actually were doing for a long time, using things like Truth or VM templates or other perverse exercises. And then came Docker and made this whole thing very easy and lightweight. And it provided a packaging format, and it provided a way to run this thing and a way to extract logs from it. So this actually made everything easier. So no wonder the continuous integration delivery tools have been pretty fast to adapt. And no wonder we suddenly saw a lot of new tools entering the market. As an example, we have a number of tools here. There's Concourse, which is the CI/CD tool for the Cloud Foundry, all based on containers. Drone CI, the GitLab CI pipelines, also based on Dockers. Yahoo open sourced their own CI/CD tool called Screwdriver last year, again based on Docker containers. And there are also tools like CodeFresh, which is a great Israeli startup providing a CI/CD service which is Docker native. They not only that they run things inside containers, they also use the Docker file itself as their main build script abstraction. And there are more, okay? So there are a lot of new tools, and most of them are great tools, and I still have to find the time to try each of them in depth and provide a good comparison. But we're not talking about that. And still, they're all new, so none of them comes even close to Jenkins if it's in its market share, if in its feature richness, and also the great community support that Jenkins has with hundreds of developers and thousands of users. So the Jenkins community was also pretty fast to embrace Docker. And the thing is, actually, that if we go to Jenkins plugin repository today and we search for the word Docker, we'll find at least 20 plugins, which are all talking about some kind of integration with Docker. And it's not that easy to understand which ones we want to use and which ones we don't. This talk will be an attempt to provide an overview. But before we start talking about plugins and how to build images in Jenkins flows, let's invert the question and see how we can run Jenkins itself inside a Docker container. Okay, I call this Jonah and the whale, because it's Jenkins sitting there in the stomach of the whale. So the first question would be, why even do that? Yeah, why would we want to run Jenkins inside Docker? And the answer is that actually what we found is, since Jenkins 2.0, Docker may be the best way to manage your Jenkins configuration. Because old ways, as for example the Puppet class that we've used to manage Jenkins configuration before version 2.0, don't really work well with the new versions because of the new installation wizard, for example. On the other hand, as I said, Jenkins community has been fast to embrace Docker, and that also means to Dockerize Jenkins installation itself. So on the Docker Hub, the official Docker Hub registry, We have Jenkins versions starting from version 1.5, packaged as Docker containers. And we have the default version based on Debian. And we also have a more lightweight version based on Alpine Linux, which weighs 140 megabytes less. And as we'll see now, it's a great way to manage the way your Jenkins is installed, configured. It's a great way to make your Jenkins installation reproducible and well-defined. Okay, so we start with the Jenkins base image, of course. We'll take the official image from the Docker Hub. I recommend going with Alpine. This will be the first line of your Docker file. And one of the things we have to deal with when we run Jenkins in a container is, of course, canceling the setup wizard, okay? Because the first time the Jenkins 2.0 comes up, we all know it comes with the setup wizard, which allows us to create the first administration user and install the suggested plugins. We don't want any of this when running in a container. So when we run Jenkins in a container, we'll add the Java property Jenkins install run setup wizard equals false. And we'll talk about the rest of the options in a minute. So, well, what all this means is we don't use the base image itself, right? We have our own configuration. So we write a Docker file. It starts with the base image coming from the Docker registry. And then we start thinking about additional things we want to put inside the Docker image for our Jenkins. With the first thing coming to mind, of course, plugins. We all use our own plugins. Jenkins isn't worth much without its plugins. So how do we install plugins? Okay, the base image already takes care of making this easy. There is a shell script called install plugins sh. It's already in there in the image. All we need to do is supply it with a list of plugins in the name : version format. A good idea will be, of course, because the list of plugins will become pretty long soon, is put all this list in a separate file and then feed that file to the shell script. Okay, then if we want security, we usually do. When we run Jenkins in a corporate setting, we have it connected to our Active Directory, to our LDAP. That can be taken care of with Groovy scripting. A good thing that anything inside our container as Jenkins instance can be modified with Groovy scripting. So if you already do write Groovy, it will be easy. If you don't write Groovy yet, you should start writing Groovy, because it's probably the best way to work with Jenkins. The Groovy scripts need to be located inside the USR share Jenkins ref init.groovyd directory. Anything dealing with security and additional options will go there. Then the question becomes, we are running Jenkins in a stateless, ephemeral Docker container. What do we do with data? As we all know, Jenkins stores all its data in XML files on disk. So where do we put that? Well, the answer is everything is stored in Jenkins in a directory that's pointed to by the Jenkins home variable. Inside the Jenkins container, this goes by default to /var/Jenkins home. So the thing we do is mounting a host directory into /var/Jenkins home, with best practice, of course, being creating a Docker volume named Jenkins, mounting it inside the container. This will make it easy for us to back up that Docker volume, to store it somewhere else, and then we'll be able to also restore the data should we want to run our Jenkins container on another server. Okay. Now regarding network, what we found is the best way is binding the Jenkins container to the host network, something that's generally not recommended for Docker executions, but specifically in the Jenkins case, as we see it, Jenkins should be probably the only container running on your Jenkins host. Okay, we are using Docker here only for the sake of packaging and configuration management. So resource-wise, you should dedicate a whole host to your Jenkins instance, and it's perfectly okay to bind to host. Because if you don't bind to host, Jenkins will have a lot of incoming and outgoing connections, and managing this with another variable of having the bridge network between Jenkins and the outside world can become unnecessarily complicated. Okay, so that was about packaging Jenkins in a Docker container and running it inside a Docker container. Actually, right here, just a second, I have a machine which does exactly that. Okay, here we have a Jenkins running in a container. If we go Docker logs Jenkins, we can see that there's Jenkins running there. I'm sorry, I forgot to silence my phone. Okay, and here is my Jenkins instance. Okay, trust me, it's running inside a Docker container. Okay, so now that we have Jenkins running inside Docker, we need to start thinking about how to run our build slave inside Docker containers. And for that, the most natural thing is to go for a plugin that has a very unexpected name of a Docker plugin. This is how it works. Docker plugin uses the cloud extension point in Jenkins. This is the same extension point that makes dynamically provisioning slaves on different cloud providers possible. Okay, so instead of defining the way to connect to a cloud services provider, we define a way to connect to a Docker host we have somewhere in our data center. This is the diagram that shows how it works. So basically, Jenkins master, we define a cloud named Docker. On that cloud, we define a number of slave templates, which are basically images and different properties that our container will get when running. Then whenever Jenkins master, with every template we associate a label, a slave label, a node label, as we know them from Jenkins. So whenever Jenkins master sees there is a job that requires a slave with a label that is associated with one of the templates of Docker images, it goes to the Docker host. It asks the Docker host to run the container, and when the container is up, Jenkins master connects to that container over SSH, or vice versa. The container connects back to the Jenkins master with the JNLP, and after that, Jenkins master uses that container as it would any virtual machine, with the benefit being that the bring up is very fast, and the container is very lightweight and ephemeral, and we don't need to pay for a new virtual machine. Things that we have to consider when working with Docker slaves in this way is that, first of all, containerized slaves are ephemeral, so we shouldn't be relying on workspace storage. even if it is preserved from execution to execution, we never know which container used it before and what ran in that container before. So any persistent data that we want to have in our builds should be archived or uploaded anywhere, which is the best practice with Jenkins anyway, but I do realize we sometimes still think that the workspace is a place we can rely on. And while you can use your Jenkins master, if it's already running Docker, as the Docker host for your executions, meaning spinning up slave containers on the same host where your Jenkins master runs, it's of course something that we shouldn't be doing for any large-scale installation, because Jenkins does require quite a lot of resources, and we don't want our slaves fighting for the same resource pool that our Jenkins master is using. Another thing to consider is that once we start using Docker, we don't not only want to run Jenkins inside Docker and not only want to run slaves inside Docker containers, we usually want to start building Docker images inside those slaves, inside those Docker containers. So the question becomes, how do you build Docker inside Docker? The best practice for that, non-related to Jenkins, is using sibling containers, which means we run a container, and when we run a container, we mount the Docker Unix socket, the socket over which the Docker client talks to the Docker daemon. We mount it inside the container. The container should, of course, have Docker CLI installed. And when that happens, we can easily run Docker build, Docker run, Docker pull inside the container with Docker daemon on the host actually doing the job. So this is how we configure this in the Docker plugin. Ooh. Looks like I'm running late. So, okay. A tip, there is another plugin called Yet Another Docker plugin, which works better than the original Docker plugin, and if you want to know why, go read the ebook. Okay, so once we have a cloud on one Docker host, it's great, but the problem is we are only limited to one Docker host. If we want another Docker host, we need to add another cloud, and then another cloud, not very comfortable to manage. So if we want someone else to manage all those Docker hosts, the logical way would be to work with orchestrators. There are 4 leading orchestrators today in the market, being Mesos Marathon, Kubernetes, Nomad, and the Docker Swarm. So let's see, no slaves running on Marathon. And there's also an unofficial Swarm plugin, which I can't really say a lot about. I only found out when doing research for this presentation. But it's unofficial, it's not hosted on the Jenkins plugin registry, so I don't know if we can rely on that. So the next thing is, of course, using Dockers inside the Jenkins pipeline. Are you using pipeline? Okay, I see more people are using Docker than they're using pipeline, which is a pity, because Jenkins pipeline is one of the greatest things that happened to Jenkins in the last 5 years, probably. So Docker pipeline plugin allows us to do a lot of things, like run things inside containers, build and push Docker images. Let's just go through them fast. So running stuff inside containers. For that, we have the inside method. Okay, Docker is available to us in Jenkins pipeline as a global variable. We can use Docker image dot inside, and then anything that we put inside the closure will be executed in the container. We can also, of course, build containers by using the Docker build method. Okay, and this returns an object of the Docker image, which we can then call push on. We can, of course, use custom Docker registries instead of the standard Docker Hub registry that Docker comes baked in with. And we can run containers and test them. There is the Docker run method, which runs a container, but then doesn't bring it down, so we have to call stop on that. Or we can use with run and use a closure, and when that closure is done, the container is stopped. And we can also use Swarm with Docker Pipeline plugin. We can use the with server method and give it a Swarm master address, and it will talk. Swarm API is compatible with the Docker standard Docker API, so it will talk with Swarm over Docker API and bring up containers on a Swarm. Okay, but if you're not using pipeline, what can you do? There are build steps for the legacy jobs, the freestyle jobs in Jenkins. First of all, there's the Docker build step plugin. It allows us to do a lot of things with Docker, like build, run, stop, start, pull, push containers. But the limitation here is that this has to be executed on the Jenkins master, which in my point of view makes it not very usable. As an alternative, there's a Docker build and publish plugin coming from CloudBiz, which also comes with an added value or a flavor of using the Docker file itself as a build script. This is, by the way, exactly the same thing that CodeFresh, the startup I mentioned earlier, does. Because in fact, as the example here shows, now, especially now that we have multi-stage Docker builds, you don't need anything else if your build is, of course, simple enough to build and pack your application than the Docker file itself. And that's how CloudBiz Docker build and publish plugin works. You just tell it where the Docker file resides, and it does all the build and push for you. Another pattern is presented by a plugin called Docker Slaves plugin. This was developed by a few CloudBiz employees as a prototype for Docker Global Hack Day. These are the objectives that they defined for developing that plugin. This also relies on Docker CLI being available on the node that we're running on. This isn't using the cloud extension point. It just brings up containers on the node that we're running on. The interesting thing about this one is that it allows us to define a composition, a number of containers running together. So this is also very nice for testing. We can run a test in one container, and if it requires a database, we can run a database container next to it. Now, a few more things about executing containers from Jenkins. We talked about container orchestrators before. We talked about the open source ones, didn't talk about proprietary ones. If you're using the Amazon ECS or the EC2 container service, there's a plugin for that. It even pretends to making automatic scale-out available, like when you don't have any more space for your containers on your current Amazon ECS cluster, it will provision new machines, new nodes for that cluster. I didn't see it working. It's not even clear from the documentation if it's already working, but worth trying. There's a nice plugin coming from CloudBiz that's called CloudBiz Docker Traceability plugin. What this allows us to do is to fingerprint our Docker images and then to trace the deployments of our containers if we use it with a number of other plugins. So we can go, there's a view in Jenkins that shows all the containers and all the images that we're building and which jobs they're coming from and where they get deployed. And there's also, of course, the CodeFresh integration plugin, which allows you to not think about the Docker infrastructure in Jenkins at all and just offload all your Docker build and execution tasks to CodeFresh. Worth checking out. And that's the overview. Any questions?